I've said before that I think that Overwatch's characters are the strongest part of this game in terms of why it's lasted so long. Yes, there's the gameplay, yes, there's the esports scene, yes, there's all these other elements of the game, but over time it's become clear it's really the characters that have kept people invested, particularly over the content drought. However, that doesn't mean that Overwatch has always done a good job of using its characters, and in this video I want to talk about what it means to use a character to their fullest potential in fiction and the ways I think Overwatch has both succeeded and failed in doing so. In previous videos I've talked about stuff like character design, or the worldviews of characters, or how Overwatch failed to expand its universe, but this is specifically about capitalizing on characters in terms of their narrative utility within a fictional universe. Before we get into it fully, quick channel update stuff, the Donathon is now concluded. We went for about 200 hours of actual streaming gameplay over the month of October and crossed a whole bunch of the reward thresholds. For the YouTube audience, there's going to be a bonus video of my choosing as well as a video topic chosen by the #1 donor. While the streaming is over, donations will continue to be counted towards individual and community rewards until midnight on October 31st for people who want to get certain rewards but miss some streams. Also, this video is a member's choice video. The next poll will start on November 1st between these 5 topics, and if you're interested in learning some more about them, be sure to stick around till the end of the video to hear more. Channel members get extra updates about videos, a server role on the Discord server, and an opportunity to vote for videos like this. Alright, on with the video. Part 1. Characters as a means to an end. The narrative of a game like Overwatch is hard to narrow down to a single character. In a lot of ways, it's an ensemble narrative on steroids. You've got so many different stories happening all around the globe with different factions and different organizations with different motivations and relationships to different characters, and it makes it pretty hard to identify really any single story as the story of this universe. In my opinion, it's a big part of why Overwatch's narrative has advanced so slowly over the years. Any time the story advances for Overwatch itself, you have to account for how the story is going to advance for Talon, for Null Sector now, for the Shamadas, for Vishkar, for the Junkers, and everyone else. Then you have to account for how individual heroes react to it. Sojourn has a different reaction than Reinhardt, or Pharah, or Mercy, or Tracer, or Winston to any story beat involving Overwatch, while Sombra has a different reaction than Reaper, or Widowmaker, or Moira, or Doomfist to any story beat involving Talon. Their motivations are complicated, and accounting for all that makes it hard to tell a fast-paced story without missing something. When it comes to telling Overwatch's story, a lot of it has been done through the individual characters. The actual narrative of Overwatch moves at a snail's pace, with a lot of the storytelling both in-game and through external media being done about specific characters on individual journeys. It's functionally world-building as narrative. The backstories and lore are the narrative, centering the characters and their individual relationships with the narrative rather than the collective narrative itself. In part, again, this is a consequence of how divergent the narrative is when you account for all the different factions and motivations of everyone involved, but it also allows us to effectively isolate the roles of individual characters in the bigger story. And honestly, for a long time, it was pretty weak. We'll talk more in the next section about how Overwatch has done it right, but first I want to talk about how it's been done wrong. A lot of Overwatch's heroes seem to exist purely because Blizzard thought the concept sounded cool, even if they didn't have the faintest idea of how they were going to reconcile them with the game's actual narrative. I'd argue that none of the original heroes demonstrate this more than Genji and Hanzo. And while Genji was able to be brought into the narrative more coherently over time, Hanzo has forever remained one of the weird outsiders to the narrative of Overwatch. He has nothing to do with the Omnic Crisis, he has no role in Talon or Overwatch as far as we know. He's basically just roaming around on his own and rarely gets any actual character development to go alongside it. Zenyatta, Symmetra, Lucio, Bastion, Zarya, Roadhog, Junkrat, and D.Va are all at best tangentially related to the original narrative of the game, so you can't just make it a story about Overwatch and Talon without neglecting them. You have to build those characters up too. And Blizzard doesn't seem to have had a plan for that, given that their approach to most of those heroes was basically just to not acknowledge them at all because it would only complicate things. I'd argue that a big part of the issue with Overwatch's narrative has been that Blizzard's approach to storytelling in Overwatch was really stuck in a mindset of utilitarianism, of these characters exist to advance the story, so if we're going to talk about them, it needs to be done in the context of advancing the overall narrative in some way. Which, okay, not the worst idea in the world, except, again, you have an ensemble cast. What is the overall narrative for all of them? This is complicated by the fact that the narratives seem to get muddled over time. Like, early cinematics show a lot of Tracer versus Widowmaker stuff, which basically wholesale disappears from the narrative after a while because it didn't seem like they knew how to justify bringing them into further conflict, despite clearly having an interesting antagonistic relationship. I've always personally felt like it was Sombra's introduction with the grander conspiracy that really sent it all off the rails, and after that, it seems like they didn't really know what to do with the story. Beyond that point, the cinematics, short stories, and comics shifted more towards heroes' backstories, but not really for the purpose of the heroes' backstories in and of themselves. Instead, it was more like they were trying to mine hero backstories to try and figure out where they could take the main narrative next, leading them to only explore character backstories when they felt like they had an angle that might go somewhere. This approach really hurt the heroes that were part of the whole "this sounds cool but they have nothing to do with Overwatch as it currently stands" group. Not only were they not part of the main story in the present day, but Blizzard wasn't exactly going to go around digging in Hanzo's backstory to try and find Overwatch's narrative when they just knew they couldn't find it there. That's not to say all the backstory stuff was bad or anything like that, just that I think that Blizzard's approach to it pretty much throughout the entirety of Overwatch 1 was misguided. Exploring individual characters was done as a means to an end. It wasn't something Blizzard was doing for the sake of itself and for the characters, but for the sake of trying to find a way to advance the narrative through those backstories. However, it still meant the characters never really got explored outside of that utilitarian lens, and it limited a lot of what we saw of them. For a franchise that relies so heavily on its characters, it's a real waste of potential. However, that doesn't mean they never learned their lesson. Part 2. Characters as an end, not a means. For a lot of Overwatch 1, the characters were often a major focus of Overwatch's story, but in a lot of ways the engagement with them as characters was often pretty surface level. If you were lucky, your hero might get a cinematic about them, and if they were a DLC hero, they'd usually get an animated origin story as well to explain why they were there. Beyond that, most of a hero's personality and their backstory was only really explored in inconsequential in-game interactions, their voice lines, their emotes, and their conversations with other heroes before the match. However, I'd argue that Overwatch 2 in particular represented a shift to Blizzard's approach to the heroes that saw them recognize the characters as the story. Instead of trying to use an ensemble cast to tell a linear story about Overwatch versus Talon, or Overwatch versus Null Sector with Talon in the chair in the corner of the hotel room as it's become now, instead the story has shifted to prioritize the characters for the sake of the characters themselves. And I get this might seem like I'm really splitting hairs here, this is a really silly distinction to make, but it's a shift in perspective that really does actually matter, and I think you can see that in how characters are being used now versus how they were used before. One of the most interesting examples to me personally is actually how Overwatch handled queer heroes in Overwatch 1 versus Overwatch 2. A big part of why Tracer and Soldier being queer hit kinda weirdly is that Overwatch's approach to the narrative didn't really seem prepared to handle that kind of character trait. It wasn't involved with the main narrative at all, and when you're thinking about the narrative as Overwatch versus Talon and not about it as a story about the characters themselves, it's really nothing more than a fun fact that they're gay as opposed to something that they could actually work with as part of their narrative, especially since neither of their romantic interests had any connection to Overwatch. You can contrast Tracer and Soldier with Pharah and Baptiste, both of whom were brought together to join Overwatch as part of the New Blood arc. Pharah deliberately and Baptiste kinda incidentally. When they both come out as queer to the audience, it's done in service of their own individual stories without really having an obvious direct consequence for the core narrative. Baptiste is bisexual and Pharah is lesbian, and that doesn't really seem to affect their relationship with Overwatch or the Null Sector crisis on face value. However, then they're given the time to elaborate. Baptiste has feelings for Cassidy, and Pharah has feelings for Mercy. That actually does change their individual motivations, and it helps to explain why these two heroes are actually willing to be brought back into the fold with an organization they have mixed feelings about. By exploring character sexualities, Overwatch 2 managed to do something that Overwatch 1 struggled with for years. Namely, how to start bringing these heroes together into the core narrative. Using characters as a means to an end wouldn't lead you to telling the story that way, but using characters as an end in and of themselves allows you to truly flesh out who they are in a way that unlocks new opportunities for you. Another good example is genuinely the Le Seraphim collab that Overwatch recently did, most clearly in terms of Sombra's role in it. When we see Sombra within Overwatch's media, she is never not on the clock. She's working 9 to 5, 24/7, and as someone who loves Sombra, I've honestly always felt pretty lucky that we've gotten so much attention for her in terms of comics, cinematics, all that stuff. However, the Le Seraphim collab, because it's non-canon, gets to explore a whole new side of her. Namely, what does the girl who's never not working actually look like when she's off the clock? Well, for this collab, she's a K-pop superfan. She's hacking streetlights to get to the concert faster, she's riding a bike so she can pass through traffic, she's got the light sticks and she's screaming like a maniac at the concert, and she's fully decked out in a high-effort concert outfit. She's also low-key, high-key toxic. Just look at how she reacts to the rest of the Overwatch girls when they think they can't get in. She shoves them out of the way and smugly presents her own ticket, and then waves goodbye to them, but when they insist upon selfies with her later, she puts herself front and center in the middle of a photograph of a friend group that she's literally not even a part of. And it honestly does tell us a lot about her in terms of who she is as a person, in terms of what she would be if she wasn't forced into the circumstances she's in. She doesn't like to hide in the shadows. She does it if she has to, but she wants to be the center of attention. She doesn't need to be part of a group. But if she's going to be one, it's going to be for her own sake. She is not casual about anything. If she cares about something, she's turning the intensity to 11 on it. And we know some of this stuff about her in theory from how she behaves in game, but seeing how those motivations manifest when it comes to something like being a K-pop stan actually does do a lot to expand upon who she is as a person that you could never do through a canonical story, because, again, canonically, Sombra doesn't have time for this. She's always on the clock, she's always working towards uncovering this conspiracy, and she's always plotting something. Using Overwatch's characters as a means to an end would never allow you to explore her like this because you necessarily have to be playing within the canon when you view characters like that. However, if you view characters as an end in and of themselves, you allow yourself to explore them outside of the canon in a way that can reveal not just more about themselves, but also their relationships to other characters that you don't really have canonical excuses for. Even the ways that the heroes use their abilities during the music videos shows something about who they are. Sombra uses hers to hack the streetlights, but seems to have actually paid for a ticket for a group she likes instead of just hacking the Omnic Bodyguard to get in. Kiriko uses hers to send them flying off a ramp with no real plan for what they're going to do in the air. D.Va uses hers to call in Toki to save them while they're in the air, and Tracer uses hers to go back in time to get the tickets that they forgot at Kiriko's apartment. Brigitte doesn't really use her actual abilities because I think hers would be a little harder to make sense of in this context, but instead she ends up being the wheelman who gets them there safely. Another example is the Loverwatch visual novel dating sim thing that they did for Valentine's Day, taking Mercy, Hanzo, and Genji outside of the canon to get to explore their personalities in a whole new context that you can't really find for them within the canon. Ultimately, what I'm trying to argue in this video is that the right way to use your characters in a story like Overwatch's is as characters who should be explored as characters, not just as props for the story. Exploring who the characters actually are might unintentionally reveal really useful motivations that long-term do help advance the narrative, like how Baptiste and Pharah's sexualities are able to help explain why they're able to be brought into Overwatch. Exploring them outside the canon also allows storytellers to flesh out who their characters are in a way that you could never do within the confines of the canon, like with Perfect Night for Sombra, Brigitte, Tracer, Kiriko, and D.Va, or with Loverwatch for Genji, Mercy, and Hanzo. Characters being used for their own sake isn't always the right approach, and it's not like every game has to do this to be good, but I think Blizzard is learning a really valuable lesson from how games like League of Legends have used their characters both in-game and external media, whether it's canon stuff like Arcane or non-canon like KDA and Heartsteel, to tell these kinds of hyper-ensemble narratives in a way that focuses on the characters and builds the story out from there. Part 3. Why does this matter? You could argue pretty easily that Blizzard bit off way more than they could chew with the Overwatch narrative, and if you look at the early lore for the game, you can tell they were kind of just making shit up as they went. It's created a lot of challenges for the present-day storytellers who have to try and wrangle it into something coherent, and while the characters are one of the game's strengths, they can also be one of its biggest obstacles because how every individual character impacts the story. The problem with having a roster full of characters who have complex, diverse worldviews and motivations is that it makes it really, really hard to actually bring them together to tell a story in a traditional sense. And I'd argue that one of the weakest points of Overwatch's storytelling for a long time was that it did a really bad job of figuring out how to build bridges between its heroes. Like, almost none of the original roster of heroes had canonically directly interacted with each other for years by the time that the first game took place, and as time went on, the problem just got worse. Almost every DLC hero released in Overwatch 1 was someone who brought a lot to the table by themselves, but didn't do much to bridge those gaps between other heroes or the bigger picture narrative. Ana, Orisa, Wrecking Ball, Ashe, and Baptiste were all lone wolves in terms of their relationships to that bigger narrative when they were introduced, while others like Sombra, Doomfist, Moira, Brigitte, and Sigma were affiliated with other heroes in a way that really only served to drag new obstacles in the way of telling a coherent story, or just didn't really add very much to it. However, one of the strengths of Overwatch 2 in terms of storytelling is that it's largely decided, fuck it, we don't have time for this, and just started dragging the characters together and forcing them to actually do some story stuff. Cassidy's recruitment adventure around the world, as told through the New Blood stories, brought a lot of the heroes who existed in their own little bubble in the narrative, himself, Pharah, Zarya, Baptiste, and D.Va, together, and then dropped them off with Overwatch. This could have turned out really lazily, but coupled with their new approach to storytelling that prioritizes heroes beyond just their narrative utility, it actually works a lot better than before. It not only brings them together to, actually advance the story, but it helps make it easier to understand why they want to be there. Part of why Overwatch's characters were originally such an obstacle for the story is that they were written with these complex motivations and worldviews that require a character-centric approach to actually engage with in a meaningful way. Without engaging with the characters as characters for their own sake, you can't really get to the bottom of why they are the way they are and how that might tie into the world, or why they might behave a certain way. Symmetra is a good example of this because you can't really engage with Symmetra as a character or bring her into the Overwatch narrative without exploring her as a character. A Better World and Stone by Stone both kind of seem like they were meant to be part of that backstories in service of the main narrative approach, but couldn't help but be drawn into exploring Symmetra's personality and worldview, and she was better for it. Overwatch 2 takes it a step further by introducing Lifeweaver and forcing her to reckon with these things not only on an individual level or a attached philosophical level, but on an interpersonal one, similar to what happens with Baptiste and Pharah, and gives her even more depth as a character in spite of the fact that she's narratively one of the most isolated heroes in the roster. The reason all of this matters is because the game's strongest point is its heroes, and at the end of the day, it risks missing out on that strength by approaching its heroes only when it needs something from them to advance the narrative. By embracing the heroes as the core of the story, wherever and whenever those heroes might be, it opens up so many better ways to use the heroes to actually tell a good story that's not only more narratively satisfying, but also gives the fans the character development they want from their favorite heroes. Anyways, that's where this one's gonna end. I'm trying to work on making my videos a little bit shorter since I've only done like 2 sub 20-minute videos since becoming a VTuber, so hopefully I'll be able to keep this one under that limit without missing out on too much. If you've enjoyed this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and if you want to support me in making these videos, consider becoming a channel member. Memberships are $5 and last for a month, and members like you get to vote for videos like the one you just watched. And, speaking of voting, November members will be choosing between these 5 videos. What Overwatch tells you to care about and why it's a problem. A new topic for the poll is about how Overwatch's leaderboard causes players to view those stats as the most important and how that messes with our understanding of individual performances as well as the game as a whole. Elo Hell and why we cope. A returning topic from September, this video would be about why people believe in Elo Hell and how people cope with their failures, real or perceived, in the context of competitive games. how Overwatch's cosmetics create a culture of classism. A returning topic from July, September, and October, this video would be about how Overwatch monetizes its cosmetics and how that in turn affects the culture that builds up around those cosmetics. Why people learn the wrong lessons from good data, a new topic that would focus on why data is so hard to interpret in terms of what actual lessons can be learned from it, and how Overwatch's statistics can be both technically accurate and deeply misleading about what went wrong and how to fix it, and who's writing Overwatch's history. The final new topic, this video would be about who gets to write the history books in the Overwatch universe, and why it matters when it comes to telling the game's story. The first round of voting will run for 7 days starting tomorrow at midnight, with the second round running for an additional 3 days between the top 2 options from the first round, with the winning video scheduled to come out on November 24th. Thank you once again to all of my channel members: MiniQ, Olesp, Cage the Orc, The Afro of Doom, Nballs, Fish Toast, Kirby PPG, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Popsnack, Connor, Yoshi of the Wire, It's Peggy BTW, Remy, CatLover192, Sourdough, Luma Riley, Venus, Monkey12 Ninja, Cadence, and Dem. Whether you're a member, subscriber, or just a viewer stopping by, thank you so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.